It's the early morning of April 12, 1981, in a quiet resort town in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Cabin 28 sits under the pine trees at the Keddie Resort in Northern California. 4 people lie dead inside, a crime so brutal and baffling that it remains unsolved over 4 decades later. This is the story of the Keddie Cabin murders, a chilling true crime mystery marked by violence, vanished evidence, and whispers of conspiracy. It's just after 10 a.m. on April 12, 1981. 14-year-old Sheila Sharp is returning home from a sleepover next door. What she sees does not seem real. In the small living room, she finds 3 bodies on the blood-soaked floor. Her mother, 36-year-old Sue Sharp, is sprawled on one side of the sofa, covered by a yellow blanket, bound hand and foot with electrical wiring. Nearby lie the bodies of her brother John, 15, and his friend, Dana Wingate, 17, also tied up with electrical cords, their heads and necks caked in blood. All 3 victims have been bound and show signs of extreme violence. Sheila's screams pierce the morning calm. She dashes out of the cabin in terror, racing back to her neighbors, the Seabolt family, for help. Neighbors Jamie Seabolt and others rush over. Peering through a bedroom window, they spot 3 young boys, Sheila's 2 younger brothers, Rick, 10, and Greg, 5, and their friend Justin Smartt, 12, miraculously alive and unhurt in the adjacent bedroom. Jamie carefully helps the boys climb out the window to safety. In a moment of concern, he enters through the back door to see if anyone else is alive, inadvertently disturbing the scene. The nightmare inside Cabin 28 is now exposed, and nothing in Kedde will ever be the same. The Sharp family's Saturday had been ordinary. Sue and the kids spent the day running errands between Kedde and nearby Quincy. John and Dana hitchhiked to town that afternoon to meet friends, while Sheila planned to spend the night next door. By 9:30 p.m., Sheila was safely at the neighbors and Sue was home in Cabin 28 with the younger boys and Justin, a friend staying over. Sue's 12-year-old daughter, Tina Sharp, had been watching TV with the Seabolts, but she returned home around 9:30 to go to bed. Sometime later that night, John and Dana likely arrived back at Cabin 28, unknowingly walking into a trap. The quiet of Kedde was disrupted at about 1:15 a.m. by muffled screams heard by neighbors in a nearby cabin. The noises faded quickly. One couple even got up to investigate, but when the screams stopped, they went back to sleep. Inside Cabin 28, however, unspeakable horror was unfolding. Evidence later showed that the living room was the primary crime scene. Blood splatter on the walls and carpet indicated a violent struggle took place there. Investigators would find 2 bloodied knives and a hammer at the scene. One knife, a steak knife, was bent grotesquely, a sign of the force used in the attacks. A second, larger knife and a claw hammer, both also covered in blood, were discovered side by side on a small table near the kitchen. Under the blanket in the living room lay Sue Sharp's body. She was nude from the waist down and had been gagged with a blue bandana and her own underwear, which were bound tightly into her mouth with medical tape. Sue had been stabbed in the chest, and her throat had been slashed so deeply that it cut through her larynx and nicked her spine. A bloodied imprint on the side of her head matched the butt of a Daisy BB rifle, suggesting she had been bludgeoned with the gun as well. John Sharp, just 15 years old, lay face up nearby. His ankles and hands were bound with electrical cords, the same cord connecting him to Dana's ankles, a cruel tether tying the victims together. John had been beaten viciously with at least 1 hammer and had his throat cut. His friend Dana had also been bludgeoned. Multiple head injuries indicated a hammer or similar weapon, and Dana's neck showed bruises consistent with manual strangulation. Autopsies later concluded that Sue and John died from a combination of knife wounds and blunt force trauma, while 17-year-old Dana died by asphyxiation from being strangled. It was a slaughter of unimaginable savagery. As Plumas County sheriff's officers finally arrive and begin combing the cabin for clues, a sense of bewilderment sets in. How could such violence be inflicted without anyone nearby realizing the full extent? And how did 3 young boys in the next room somehow sleep through the massacre unharmed? Investigators are stunned that Rick, Greg, and Justin survived unscathed in the adjacent bedroom, not even awakened by the chaos that killed the others. The fact that the perpetrators chose to spare the younger children while obliterating the rest of the family is one of the many perplexing aspects of the case. In those first hours, law enforcement had their hands full. The crime scene was complex and deeply disturbing. Blood trails were found leading down the hallway to the bedrooms, including Tina's room, where investigators noted blood drops on her bed, suggesting she may have been bleeding as she was taken from the house. Because chillingly, 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing from the scene. Initially, amidst the confusion, officers didn't realize a 4th victim might be involved, until young Justin reportedly told them repeatedly that Tina wasn't there and was in danger. Fearing a kidnapping, police launched a search of the area for Tina, hoping to find her alive despite the carnage that had befallen her family. Sheriff Doug Thomas, the county's top lawman, took charge of the investigation. From the very beginning, the evidence strongly suggested more than one killer was involved. Whoever did this, and there was more than one person, had to have blood all over them, Sheriff Thomas later noted of the forensic attacks. Indeed, controlling and murdering 3 people, and possibly abducting a 4th, would have been extremely difficult for a single attacker. Multiple weapons were used and multiple victims were subdued at once, pointing to at least 2 perpetrators working in concert. It appeared the killers had cut phone lines and possibly entered the cabin quietly before a violent struggle erupted. What unfolded after the discovery would later be harshly criticized as a bungled investigation, or worse. In the critical first 48 hours, some crucial missteps occurred. The crime scene was not properly sealed off. Multiple people, including neighbors and potential suspects, were allowed to wander in and out of the cabin before all evidence was collected. This contamination is a detective's nightmare, making it nearly impossible to reconstruct the exact events of that night. The small Plumas County Sheriff's Office was overwhelmed by the brutality of the crime, and they soon called for help from the state. The California Department of Justice sent in 2 special agents. The FBI briefly became involved as well, given that Tina was missing and her case would be considered a kidnapping. Strangely, within 2 weeks, the FBI retreated, saying the state investigators were doing an adequate job. Some would later question why the FBI backed off so soon in such a serious interstate crime, especially when a 12-year-old girl was still missing. The lack of coordination and urgency in those early days meant leads that might have been followed went cold almost immediately. Inside the cabin, forensic work was, by later accounts, poorly handled. Technicians collected what evidence they could, but key pieces of evidence were lost, misplaced, or never analyzed properly at all. For example, investigators lifted at least 1 bloody fingerprint from a handrail on the back stairs, yet it was never properly analyzed or matched to any suspect. Blood and fiber samples were collected, but many were not processed with the rigor one would expect from a case of this magnitude. One shocking lapse involved a dark, bloody jacket that Justin's mother, Marilyn Smartt, turned in, saying it belonged to her husband, Marty. Despite this potentially crucial piece of evidence, there is no record that the jacket was ever tested for blood type or DNA. Vital forensic opportunities slipped away. Some evidence wouldn't be tested until decades later. With each passing day, the trail to the killers grew fainter. Yet from the outset, investigators did have suspects in mind. As sheriff's deputies canvassed the tiny community of Kedde, one name kept coming up: Marty Smartt, the stepfather of 12-year-old Justin, the boy who survived the night in the cabin. Marty Smartt was a 27-year-old Vietnam veteran who lived just 2 cabins away from the Sharps, in cabin 26 with his wife Marilyn. In the weeks before the murders, Marty had been heard expressing seething anger towards Sue Sharp. According to some reports, he felt Sue was meddling in his troubled marriage, advising Marilyn to leave him perhaps, and this had made him furious. On the night of April 11th, Marty and Marilyn had a house guest, Marty's close friend Boubede, a 55-year-old ex-con from Chicago who had been staying with them. That evening, the Smarts and Bo went out for drinks at the local bar in Kedde where Marty worked as a chef. According to Marty's later account, they invited Sue Sharp to join them, but she declined since she needed to watch her kids. The trio went without her, only to return home early because Marty complained the bar's music was too loud. Back at cabin 26, Marilyn said she went to bed around 11 p.m. Marty wasn't done for the night though. He actually called the bar to gripe about the music volume, an alibi that some found odd. Marty and Bo then left home a second time without Marilyn and returned to the bar for a short while before coming back very late. The timeline of Marty Smart's movements that night is suspiciously complex. Did Marty and Bo really step out just to complain about loud music? Or were they out committing murder? As officers interviewed neighbors the next day, Marty Smart's behavior raised red flags. He said a claw hammer had gone missing from his house, oddly specific and potentially important since a hammer was clearly used in the murders. In fact, one of the murder weapons was believed to be a second hammer that was never found at the scene, suggesting the killers took it with them. Marty also volunteered that both he and Bo suffered from PTSD due to Vietnam, perhaps to explain any inconsistencies in their memories. Investigators already viewed Marty with caution, and his statements did little to lessen their suspicions. Within days, Marty, Bo, and even Marilyn were all interviewed by law enforcement. During one interview, Marilyn Smartt dropped a bombshell. She revealed she had decided to leave Marty just days after the murders, describing him as violent and abusive with a vicious temper. This admission strengthened investigators' theory that Marty might have had a personal motive to target Sue Sharp, blaming her for encouraging Marilyn to separate. With such a motive in Marty's inconsistent timeline, the sheriff's office made him the prime suspect. Bo, Marty's house guest, was also scrutinized. He was an ex-con with alleged ties to organized crime in Chicago, and he had only just arrived in Kedde shortly before the murders. It looked like Marty and Bo could be the 2 men responsible for the massacre. To follow protocol, Sheriff Thomas had Marty Smartt take a polygraph test. At this critical juncture, the case took a baffling turn. Marty Smartt passed the polygraph, according to the sheriff. In 1981, a past lie detector test was enough for law enforcement to clear Marty of suspicion, and that's exactly what happened. Despite the glaring circumstantial evidence in Marty's suspicious behavior, authorities released him and Bo. In fact, they were effectively allowed to leave town shortly afterward, and leave they did. Marty abruptly moved out of Kedde, and Bo, who had only been visiting, also left the area. In the span of just a few weeks, the 2 primary suspects in a quadruple homicide were questioned and let go, disappearing over the horizon. Sheriff Doug Thomas later defended this decision, saying nothing concrete tied them to the crime at the time. With nothing in those first weeks that tied them to the crime, neither were charged, Thomas recalled. Both men had been cooperative in interviews and denied involvement. Thomas noted that it's easy to accuse dead men, and he remained unconvinced of their guilt years later. But many in the community and within law enforcement were not so sure the right call was made back in 1981. Meanwhile, young Justin Smartt became an unexpected source of insight. Initially, he told police that he slept through the ordeal and didn't hear anything. But as days passed, the 12-year-old's story began to change. Justin said he remembered a dream about the murders. Under hypnosis by a therapist and with investigators present, Justin recounted a scenario that sounded less like a dream and more like a repressed memory. In his dream, he awoke to noises in the living room and peeked out to see Sue Sharp confronted by two men, one with long hair and glasses, the other with shorter, greased hair. He described how the men tied up Johnny and Dana, rendering them helpless, and how Sue tried to intervene. In this eerie account, Tina came out of her bedroom partway through the carnage, at which point one of the intruders snatched the girl, dragging her out of the cabin as she cried for help. Then, Justin dreamed, there was silence. Justin's recollection was remarkably specific. He even worked with a sheriff's sketch artist to produce composite drawings of the two attackers he claimed to have seen. These sketches showed two adult males, both wearing gold-framed glasses, one with a mustache and longer straight hair, the other with shorter hair. Oddly, the sketches bore more than a passing resemblance to Marty Smartt, who wore glasses, and his friend Bo. However, this lead was fumbled as well. Instead of using a professional forensic artist from the Department of Justice or FBI, local authorities inexplicably assigned an amateur, a man with no training and reportedly a friend of the sheriff, to draw the composite sketches. The decision was never explained, but it resulted in sketches that some felt were of poor quality and questionable value. Whether by design or incompetence, an opportunity to create accurate suspect renderings was arguably wasted. As weeks turned into months, the case stalled. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office, under intense pressure, pursued other leads. There were rumors of the killings being drug-related or some kind of ritual crime, but no evidence of that turned up. Indeed, Sheriff Thomas publicly dismissed early rumors that the murders were ritualistic or connected to drug trafficking, noting that no drugs or paraphernalia were found in the cabin. The working theory remained that it was a personal crime, retaliation or revenge, carried out by one or more people from the community who knew the Sharp family. Yet, with the prime suspects gone and little physical evidence processed, the investigation ground on aimlessly. No arrests were made in 1981, nor in the years that followed. The Sharp family murders were turning cold. 3 years passed with no sign of young Tina Sharp. The hope that she might have been taken and kept alive gradually faded. Then on April 11, 1984, exactly 3 years to the day after the family was attacked, a bottle scavenger stumbled upon a fragment of a human skull at Camp 18, a remote wooded area near Feather Falls in neighboring Butte County. The location was roughly 50 miles from Kedde. Investigators arrived and sifted the area, uncovering part of a mandible as well. Dental records confirmed the worst. These were the remains of Tina Sharp, now discovered 3 years after her abduction. The cruel postscript to the tragedy was that Tina had been killed and dumped in a lonely forest, far from home. Shortly after the discovery hit the news, an anonymous call came into the Butte County Sheriff's Office. The caller told police that the skull found belongs to Tina Sharp, startling details that had not yet been confirmed publicly. For reasons unknown, this call was not documented or followed up on at the time, yet another investigative failure. In fact, the audio tape of the call vanished into an evidence box, apparently ignored for decades. It wasn't until 2013 that a deputy sorting old case files stumbled on an unmarked, sealed envelope containing a tape of that 1984 call. On the recording, the caller correctly identified the remains as Tina's before official identification had been made. "It's my feeling that either he was told or he was involved in some way," said Mike Gamberg, a veteran investigator who later worked the case, referring to this mysterious caller. The fact that such a crucial clue languished unnoticed for years only fueled suspicions of a cover-up. Was it sheer incompetence that led to this oversight, or something more deliberate? Many years later, People would ask with frustration, how could evidence like this go missing? By the mid-1980s, the trail was ice cold. Sheriff Doug Thomas had moved on to another job by 1983, and a cloud of frustration hung over Plumas County. Officially, the Keddie murders remained unsolved, with no arrests and no justice for the 4 slain victims. Unofficially, however, many locals whispered that the killers' identities were known, that the investigation had been compromised. Rumors swirled of a cover-up. Some suspected that Sheriff Thomas had been too close to Marty Smartt, possibly even friendly, and had not pursued him hard enough. Others speculated that Beau's alleged organized crime connections earned him protection. Maybe he was a protected informant, and that state agents had steered the investigation away from him. These theories were never proven, but the strange missteps and omissions in the case gave them traction. Why were obvious suspects allowed to walk free? Why was evidence ignored or lost? The community had no good answers. As one account later put it, key information was actively ignored or downplayed by law enforcement. Whether due to incompetence or something more deliberate is still up for debate. In the absence of arrests, suspicion fell on the investigators themselves. Both primary suspects, as fate would have it, died before ever facing charges. Beau died in 1988 at age 66. Marty Smartt died in 2000, still a free man. It seemed the chance to solve the case might have died with them, but the story wasn't over. In 2010, a new sheriff took office in Plumas County. Greg Hagwood, who had himself been a 16-year-old classmate of Johnny Sharp and Dana Wingate back in 1981. Their murders had haunted him into adulthood. Determined to shake loose the truth, Sheriff Hagwood hired Mike Gamberg, a retired sheriff's detective who had known the Sharp family, to reopen the Keddie case in 2013. Gamberg started from scratch, organizing boxes of evidence and reports that had been gathering dust. What he found was astounding. Early on, Gamberg rediscovered the forgotten letter that Marty Smartt had written to his wife Marilyn in the days after the murders. The letter, never acted upon back in 1981, contained what looked very much like a confession. Marty wrote, "I've paid the price for your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we're through," ending with a sarcastic, "Great, what else do you want?" In other words, Marty was declaring that he had bought Marilyn's love with 4 lives, the exact number of victims at Cabin 28. Marilyn, who had since remarried, told People magazine she didn't recall ever receiving that letter at the time. She only learned of it much later from investigators, but she confirmed it was Marty's handwriting. Shockingly, the sheriff in 1981, Doug Thomas, also said he was never aware of this letter. As Gamberg noted, the letter had been overlooked and never admitted into evidence. To him, it was an outrageous oversight, one that might have changed everything had it been used back then. Reflecting on the original investigation, Gamberg remarked bitterly, "You could take someone just coming out of the academy, and they'd have done a better job." Gamberg's fresh look turned up even more. He tracked down the therapist in Reed, Onabata, whom Marty Smartt had allegedly seen in the months after the murders. Astonishingly, the therapist confirmed a long-circulating rumor. Marty confessed during a session that he had killed Sue and Tina Sharp. However, Marty claimed he had nothing to do with the boys. He chillingly explained that he murdered 12-year-old Tina because she had witnessed the whole thing and couldn't leave a witness behind. This confession had been reported to the police back then, but apparently nothing was done with it. The therapist told Gamberg he was shocked that the investigators in 1981 hadn't acted on Marty's admission. Piece by piece, it became clear that the case hadn't gone cold for lack of evidence. Rather, evidence had been there all along, ignored. In 2016, a wave of new leads and publicity reinvigorated the investigation. While speaking with locals, Gamberg heard an unusual tip. A man using a metal detector around Kedde years earlier had found a buried hammer in a pond just down the road from the Sharps' cabin. Gamberg followed up and recovered a steel, blue-handled claw hammer from the pond. It exactly matched the description of Marty Smart's missing hammer from 1981. Forensic tests were done to check for any DNA or blood residue on the rusted tool. Sheriff Hagwood remarked on how unlikely it was for a hammer to wind up in that pond by accident. The location it was found, it would have been intentionally put there. It would not have been accidentally misplaced, Hagwood said, strongly suggesting the hammer was thrown in the water to hide it. To the new investigators, this was potentially the murder weapon used on John and Dana, a tangible link to the killers that had been hidden for 35 years. Even more promising, modern forensics yielded a DNA clue. In April 2018, the state lab was finally able to extract identifiable DNA from a piece of white medical tape used to bind the victim's hands and ankles. The DNA was matched to a known living suspect, according to Sheriff Hagwood. The name has not been made public, but this development indicated that at least one conspirator might still be alive and on law enforcement's radar. Plumas County officials have not made an arrest yet, but they confirmed they were comparing the DNA and even the anonymous call tape from 1984 to individuals connected with the case. By 2018, Sheriff Hagwood and investigator Gamberg stated that the evidence leans toward Marty and Bo as the killers, with additional accomplices who helped after the fact. In their view, several people knew or participated in covering up the crime, including the disposal of Tina's body. There are people locally who know more than they've said, Hagwood revealed. We've identified some of them, we know who they are, and we know where they are. I have every confidence that they either participated after the fact or have first-hand information. It was a startling claim that more than 2 people were involved in this atrocity, and that a pact of silence kept the truth buried. But at last, it seemed the veil was beginning to lift. The new investigators were not shy about condemning the original inquiry. They openly suggested that either stunning incompetence or outright corruption had let Marty and Bo slip away. As one article summed up, the twists and turns of the investigation, marked by botched procedures, suspicious behavior, and lingering doubts, paint a picture of not just a brutal crime, but of systemic failure to deliver justice. Decades have now passed since that awful spring night in 1981. Keddie's resort cabins are mostly gone. Cabin 28 itself was torn down in 2004, its logs and timbers hauled off like a grave being erased. But the memory of the murders has never faded. The case remains officially unsolved, but many feel the truth is essentially known. In the court of public opinion, Marty and Bo, both now deceased, are the likely culprits, and possibly a few others helped them get away with it. The question on everyone's mind, will there ever be justice? Over 40 years later, no one has ever been arrested or charged for the Keddie murders. It's a fact that continues to haunt surviving family members and investigators alike. Sheila Sharp, the girl who found her family that morning, grew up without her mother and siblings. She has spent a lifetime demanding answers. It struck this community harder than anything, recalls investigator Mike Gamberg of the murder's impact. Plumas County, a tight-knit rural area, lost its innocence on that day. Rumors of cover-ups by law enforcement persist. Some locals believe certain officers back then did not want the case solved for reasons unknown. Perhaps personal connections, or perhaps pressure from above. Others simply believe the case overwhelmed a small department that made egregious mistakes. What truly happened in Cabin 28 that night? Why were some children spared while others were brutally killed? And how did critical pieces of evidence, like Marty's ominous letter, go unexamined for so long? These questions have tormented everyone who has probed this case. The current sheriff's department hasn't given up. As of the 40th anniversary in 2021, Sheriff Hagwood and Gamberg insisted they were close to solving it. "I believe in one way, shape, or form we are going to pull this together," Gamberg said confidently. They emphasized that there's no statute of limitations on homicide. If living accomplices can be charged, they will be. For the Sharp family and the community of Kedde, the scars of April 12, 1981 have never fully healed. The case stands as a tragic example of a failed justice system, a systemic failure to deliver justice, as one account described it. It's also a stark reminder of the human cost of an unresolved crime. The surviving children, like Sheila, had to grow up under the shadow of a nightmare with no closure. Neighbors and law enforcement officers lived with guilt and doubt, wondering if they could have done more. Conspiracy theories still swirl. Was there a police cover-up to protect the guilty? Did powerful forces interfere with the investigation? We may never know every detail, but we do know that serious mistakes were made, and 4 innocent lives were taken brutally and prematurely. 40-plus years later, the truth feels tantalizingly close, yet still out of reach. Investigators remain hopeful that one day a final piece of evidence or a courageous witness will crack the case. Until then, the Keddie Cabin murders live on as one of America's most haunting unsolved crimes, a story of violence, mystery, and the dogged pursuit of justice long delayed. The echoes of that night in Kedde still linger. 4 lives lost, no arrests, 40 years of questions. But those who remember the victims continue to seek the truth, and in the end, the hope remains that justice, no matter how delayed, will one day come for Cabin 28.